Welcome to the Reconstructing Inclusion Podcast. My name is Amri Johnson, your host. I hope you're well. Join me as we continue to deconstruct the shortcomings of traditional DEI strategies and co-create a vision for more transformative, human-centered approaches to inclusion. Myself and my esteemed guests will challenge the status quo, dive deep into the reactive, supplemental nature of many DEI initiatives. We'll explore how to reclaim the profound and transformational potential of inclusion as a catalyst for collective growth, empowerment, and organizational change. Season 2 of the Reconstructing Inclusion Podcast starts now. Hello, and welcome to the Reconstructing Inclusion Podcast. My name is Amri Johnson. I'm your host. Over the past, year or two, I've been on quite a few podcasts. Great questions have been asked. And when I thought about what I wanted to do for this episode, I decided to go back and review some of those podcasts. I did so such that I could, figure out which questions really resonated or which tell a story about what we're up to at my company, Inclusion Wins, and my personal philosophy around this work and how I got into it. So today, what I'd like to do is go through a few of those questions, 10 to be exact, that have been asked of me on other podcasts. So let's get into it. Question number 1, what is your background and how did you get into DEI work? I think my journey into DEI work happened when I was a child because my father grew up in Topeka, Kansas. And if you know the history of the United States and segregation, Topeka was a place where Plessy versus Ferguson, which was doctrine in the late 1800s that made people separate but equal, was reinforced, was broken down via the case of Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas. So my dad in 1954-55 began to desegregate public schools in Topeka, Kansas. It wasn't always easy. Obviously, I wasn't there. But the way my dad behaved, and I'm recording this on his birthday, so there's a little energy behind this. My dad never let that be a barrier to him. He never held it as something that he has to consistently or continuously revisit. It happened. He dealt with the adversity of it, and he went on to build businesses, raise a family, and give me one of the best dads that one could ever have. Now, did he talk about white people and sometimes the ways of white folks? Absolutely. Did that leave me in a place that I felt like white folks were the enemy, the bad ones, the racist? No. I've had times where I might have felt that way about some individuals, but never have I felt that way about a skin color of people around the world. So that was the beginning. I think I started being introduced to thinking about this work to be clear that there were injustices and that to address them didn't mean we separate. It meant we understand. It means we increase our capacity for magnanimity, compassion, and be in contact with the so-called other. Now, that was then. This is now. I didn't jump into DEI work because I had an adverse experience or I saw a bunch of adverse experiences amongst people that look like me. I worked in public health and I saw, and as I went to a historically Black college and I was around a lot of people in public health, I ended up getting a degree in epidemiology. I'd done public health stuff since I was in college and HIV prevention stuff. I was really involved in public health. And I saw an opportunity when I went out on my own to get involved in what's called corporate diversity because I was working in the health disparity space and I started finding and identifying some folks who did this work in companies. I didn't know what DEI was. I was like, wow, you can go there and make money. So that was my kind of initial way of thinking about this. But now I see that I saw rather that there's a way to do this work, do good work, make contributions, serve companies to help them create the conditions for all their people to thrive. And that's how I've framed my DEI work since my first kind of real role as a member of the Cook Ross team, which was started by Howard Ross a long time ago. And Howard has been a huge mentor, friend, big brother to me for a long time. We've even recently did some work together this year. So I worked as an epidemiologist. I went into organizational effectiveness consulting primarily because I was really didn't have any clue about being a manager and I wanted to learn everything I could about management and leadership, and subsequently started a company and then met Howard Ross through his wife, Leslie Traub. And from there, ended up at Novartis, and the rest is history. Now, inclusion wins, my book, Reconstructing Inclusion, living in Switzerland, et cetera. So that's the fast forward. And that's something that I'm not going to go into a lot of depth around. But my public health, my epidemiology lens provided a unique way of looking at organizations, at the dynamics of differences and similarities, those tensions, and looking at them somewhat dispassionately. Didn't mean I was without passion, but it meant that I was able to look at these things with as much evidence as possible to address them. Question number 2. How do you view the relationship between DEI and anti-racism? I think there's somewhat of a false dichotomy between these two things. And I think over the past few years, it's played out because a lot of people reverted to the Ibram X. Kendi or Robin DiAngelo form of anti-racism or white fragility, et cetera. And I just never subscribed to these binaries. I don't think that they work. I don't think they're helpful. Is there a relationship? Should we be doing anti-oppression work? Should we be looking at dynamics of racism and addressing them in a mindful way? Yes. Should we be outraged at everything that happens to somebody because they're brown or black? We should be outraged, but we shouldn't be outraged against another, because a lot of things happen that are intraracial that we don't get outraged about. And I think that's one of the bigger problems is we're looking for racism. We're looking for those social injustices. And I think that level of surveillance, without thinking about the surveillance that we need to have more upstream before these things happen, to me is problematic. So there's no kind of dichotomy between DEI and anti-racism. They should be together. They should be about all of us being mindful that racism exists, that these types of discrimination exist, and that they're less than they've ever been, and that to address them, it's mostly for us to go upstream to create the conditions for everybody to thrive and do that over and over and over again till we get to the place where the way of being around this is normative, not that we're trying to anti something. We're trying to perpetuate something that is always putting us in a space where everybody can do well, not just marginalized groups, even recognizing the history where there has been disparity that and gaps that we need to close. We have to do that with the lens that everybody wins if we do this well. And those who have been historically marginalized in terms of their skin color doesn't necessarily mean they're marginalized now. And it means that there are others that are not of the brown, black skin color that we often reference that are in a way marginalized or missing opportunity because they haven't been, a system hasn't been created for them to be able to thrive. So this is an everyone conversation. There is no dichotomy. And if we make that dichotomy, we'll run into problems. And I think we're seeing how those play out now. And we're pushing back against that instead of really going upstream and thinking about our role as practitioners and what we can do to prevent these things from happening downstream, even till the moment that we're in today. Question 3, what's your approach to deconstructing and reconstructing the DEI paradigm? I've found that traditional DEI approaches have been insufficient. Now, I'm not saying that's for everybody who practices it, but mostly we've been on this kind of identity by identity journey. You go, and this group needs this, and this group needs that. And that's absolutely uh, something that we need to consider, because there are some considerations for groups based on their needs that might be cataloged somewhere, and everybody's unique. So if we say this is the blanket approach for X group, but we don't recognize that these same things will be helpful to everyone, we miss the point. And what it often does is have us separate instead of connect. So I believe in contact over caucus. I don't mean that caucuses like single identity ERGs. It doesn't mean that people that are more like one another shouldn't get together. I'm not about that. I get together with my Black friends just as much I get together with mixed groups of friends or all non-Black friends. Living in Switzerland, you can imagine, in many cases, I can be the only so-called, right? And that I don't even really think about it unless I move outside or somebody asks me about it, right? But I believe in contact, people that come across or connect across their differences, particularly around something that they share, something that they want to create together. In organizational life, this is critical. So when I think about the traditional approaches, I think they're incomplete. I think we need to move beyond just focusing on representation, because I think that's where the default is for the public, is that DEI is about hiring people that are less represented in a particular discipline or a particular company. And in a way it is, but to do that as the main thing and that becomes the focus, I think is off the mark. We need to create the conditions for this level of representation to happen sustainably. That means we're going upstream to say, all right, if we look at the numbers, how many people are training to be in these roles? How many people can take other roles in the organization that might not require that training, and then build those skills so that down the line, they become inspiration for those that might not have seen people that look like them. But it doesn't mean that we're spending all of our time trying to get these people, because what happens is you just pull folks from other companies that have those skills. There really isn't any overall tide that raises all ships. It just means we're just pulling one from the other. And that becomes this competition for them instead of creating the conditions for your company to have a robust talent pipeline that happens to be diverse because you put the energy and effort into creating those conditions over time. It takes time. It takes system reconstructing. It takes understanding that the old paradigm probably hasn't served us, and we keep having the same kind of reincarnated conversation about lack of representation, but we haven't necessarily gone upstream to the way that we need to go upstream. And so it just says, see, that's the problem. You see, you still don't have any Black people. That's a problem. And look, I know that this is going to happen, but I think if we really want to deconstruct and reconstruct the paradigm, we have to look beyond that. We have to look at integrating DEI into organizational design and making sure we build it into all of the systems in an organization, from strategy to the how power is used in the hierarchy, to how teams function, to how we reward and recognize people, and of course, in our candidate experiences. We also need to foster cultural intelligence. There's a set of skills under cultural intelligence that's very critical. And we have to understand the dynamics of our networks. That goes back to representation, as most representation gaps are often about our networks. You go to folks that have been in your 1, maybe 2 degree connections and you recruit from there. And sometimes that means going to the same schools. It means going to your old companies. And that's fantastic, but it's incomplete. And we have to look at our networks to see where are those other connections that maybe we haven't tapped into, and make sure that we build that up in a robust way that could be sustained over time. Question 4. How do you deal with resistance to DEI initiatives? Well, don't cancel people because they resist DEI initiatives or they make mistakes. Instead, let's focus on the dialogue, the learning together, creating opportunities for everyone to grow with intention. That becomes an organizational edict. This growth is sacrosanct. Everybody has to have it. And if we're missing the mark somehow, that we don't understand people's interests, then we need to do better. And that's not about those who are a certain skin tone. This is about everybody. Some people need different help and different experiences in different ways, but this is for all. So I don't really push back against resistance. I let it come. The main thing is, can you be open enough to be a beacon for dissent? Can you take in the resistance and say, wow, thank you for coming forward and sharing that perspective with me without automatically reacting? Can you be reflective in your ability to hear, to listen, to take that into account and design your work with those voices in mind, just as much as those who you might consider pro DEI? So I don't push back against the resistance. I let it come. I let that tension come across. And if I push back, it's just lightly enough that we can create the kind of tension that we need to create a bridge. 5, are you optimistic about the future of DEI efforts? I am more optimistic about DEI than I've ever been. Why? Because when you start getting resistance, you know that the conversation has elevated. The problem is what we've done is, rather than really dance with that resistance, we've decided to say, oh, those are the people that we need to push back again, those racist people. It doesn't work. It's not helpful. It doesn't get us to where we want to be. So I'm optimistic because I believe we can now separate the wheat from the chaff. We had a lot of people jump into this industry, into this space, so to speak, DEI space, because they saw some opportunity to vent some of their frustrations, to go out and make the world better, because I got all the racists to understand that you need to be like this and you need to not question Black people and you need to just listen to Black people. But all this stuff that came up, and you need to do these things, full stop. All right. I appreciate people listening to Black people. And I also appreciate people saying, you know what, Amri, I don't agree with you. Actually, I appreciate that more because I learn more when they do. And so I'm optimistic. I believe frameworks are being created. People are diving into the evidence. People are doing what they can to create the conditions for everyone to thrive. They're doing things principle centered. And we're going to move away from any ideological notions of what DEI is, because those notions, from my perspective, are the things that are creating the resistance and bad faith. There's a lot of people that resist the notions of DEI, the ideological notions, and they do it in good faith because they fundamentally believe in DEI, but they don't necessarily agree with the approach. I think now we're creating approaches that, and I know this is the case with a lot of people that I'm talking to, approaches that are accessible, meaning for everybody, that are unambiguously prioritized and that are aligned with the organization's reason for being. And when we do that, we create extraordinary value, some of it more social, others, I believe we create a robust economic value as well. I'm not saying that there's a strong causal relationship between those things, but I think there's enough evidence to say that when people are happy, when people feel like they have supported relationships, people thrive. And if people thrive and continue to learn and grow, then your organization generally follows that. 6, how do you define diversity and inclusion? So I use the definition of Dr. Roosevelt Thomas. Dr. Thomas was a pioneer in this field. I think everybody should be reading Dr. Thomas's books. They're really so incisive that if you haven't read them and you're entering into this work, I advise you to. Dr. Thomas moved away from the notion of focusing DEI on race and gender. In fact, he wrote a book about it. I think it was in 1991. So think about that. He wrote a book called Beyond Race and Gender in the 90s. Where are we now? So his definition is any mixture of similarities and differences and their respective tensions and complexities. That's how I define diversity. Diversity is similar and different attributes. It's respective tensions and complexities. And it's not just relegated to an individual human. There's diversity in disciplines. There's diversity in the way companies are structured. There's diversity in what companies work to produce over time. It's differences in geography. So all these similarities and differences have to be taken into account. And when we do, I think we create a lot more understanding of context. And so I think similarities and differences, respective tensions and complexities, and thus the contextual dynamics that are critical for us to better relate to one another. Now, inclusion is a relational construct. I define it as any action that creates the conditions for people to thrive and for your organization to be generative. Generative organizations create thick value, that is, value just beyond the bottom line. So, inclusion is any action that creates the conditions for people to thrive and for your organization to be generative. 7, how do you approach DEI interventions? Well, my preference is not to have an intervention. My preference is to integrate this into how business gets done. If I have to do an intervention, I don't believe that we should focus on a single intervention. I think they can be counterproductive if they're not part of a larger approach. If you do an intervention or an event, for example, it should involve everyone. There should be follow-up actions and communication to ensure ongoing engagement. We need a long-term strategy that includes the communication and bringing people in to get into action. So I think single interventions, events, talks are great, and I do them. I do them. I like them. And the idea is there something behind it that can pull folks forward and make them feel like they want to push things forward together. So interventions are not one-offs. People need to be able to get into action together, preferably across differences and similarities in a way that everybody sees how it benefits the whole. 8, how do you apply systems thinking to DEI? I don't think there's any DEI that's done well without systems thinking. So, everything is interdependent in organizational life. I think we have to have that systems thinking lens because it has to be integrated into all aspects of how the organization works. So I look at systems thinking as what does the system need? Where are the various spaces and elements of that system that we might be missing in terms of creating what we're working to create for the organizational culture and for obviously its people. And so there's things that we just have to recognize are there, oftentimes hidden. And when we use systems thinking, we begin to let those things emerge. And when those things emerge, we can address them mindfully and together. And people understand that they are not like optional. They're not like something that we're just doing because we have to do it. It's not just a training. It's not just a thing that we did because some other company did it. The system that we're in at that particular time is the context and history, et cetera, that needs to be taken into consideration before we design anything. And so systems thinking allows us to do that. I oftentimes go to Peter Singe's definition of leadership. Leadership is the capacity or capability for human systems to shape their future. That means if we are in action with DEI, just like with leadership, we're creating the conditions to shape the future. It means we can create more adaptability. It means we can create a different level of care, openness, safety, and trust. And we do that perpetually. We build the skills, some call them durable skills, to make sure we can maintain that from one high point to one low point and everything in between, that we continue to be able to adapt to whatever comes at us and be prepared for the next thing. Not because we anticipated it like it was absolutely going to happen, but we, in a way, had some perspection and we were prepared for whatever comes to us. That's what I believe is important to DEI where systems thinking is concerned. And it needs to be a way of being so that we just become better at being organizations. We become better at creating the conditions for what we want for our organization to create immense value. 9, what's your perspective on meritocracy in relation to DEI? This is a hot topic. It's gone on for a while, and I do a lot with clients around this notion of meritocracy. We know, if you've ever read The Rise of Meritocracy by Baron Michael Young, you know that meritocracy was created as satire. The whole idea of it, we've normalized it in organizational life and in societies around the world, because we've confused merit with meritocracy. Meritocracy was basically saying those who were of the aristocracy, get it? Aristocracy, meritocracy, would think that because they've had advantage for a long time, that their kids or their next generation was smarter than the ones that didn't have that advantage. And that was going to make people start thinking that if I give all my kids these advantages, these people just aren't that good. And that's why they don't get the rewards that we get. You get that? So meritocracy is a myth. The originator, who coined the phrase meritocracy, knew that, and he wanted to prevent it. Before he died, he wrote an article and said, it's not working because we've attached to this myth. Myths are ideals. Meritocracy is an ideal, but because of history and because of what Baron Young said, it's obviously an incomplete notion. So I challenge the notion of meritocracy, as it often overlooks individuals who may not have had the same opportunities or access to resources. Instead, we should focus on recognizing potential and providing development opportunities and emphasizing all the things that are the evidence tells us is working. Good mentoring, coaching, opportunities to grow, people there to support you, community. So merit, good. Meritocracy, mythology. Mythology, helpful to inform what we're trying to create, but not the truth. We need people to have merit. We need people to grow. We need people to put in the work to make their best contribution. And we know that some people are going to have more help. That's just true. I got help. I've been more privileged than most. Okay. So everybody gets help. Merit is good. Meritocracy is a myth. Doesn't mean it's unhelpful, but it's an ideal that we only get to if we understand that we need to create the conditions for everybody to thrive. And when we do that, doesn't mean everybody gets the same rewards, but it does mean that people can be satisfied that they put in this effort and they get a reward that's equivalent to the effort that they make. Lastly, question number 10. How do you see AI, or artificial intelligence, impacting DEI? I wrote a chapter on this in Reconstructing Inclusion, but this was before the advent of large language models, OpenAI, ChatGPT, all the others, right? So I didn't get into that level of depth. I did talk a little bit about artificial intelligence when it comes to things that might harm people. Talked about Joy Buliawimi's work in coded bias and some of that work before she wrote her book and her research when she was at MIT. But I think AI should be approached in a way that enhances humanity rather than compromising it. And that means you need people questioning the way that large language models are trained. You need people making sure that they're not just trained on Western ideas, which I think are by their nature incomplete. I think we have a huge opportunity to use AI for good where it comes to hiring, et cetera. But I think we need to look at how to do that. Like people are using AI to, for example, to de-individualize or take away things that have historically been discriminated against on resumes. I don't know if the evidence plays out to say that absolutely works, but people are jumping on the bandwagon to take away things like, anything that recognizes that you might be Black, including your name. And I think, that does is just pushes the can, pushes the notions out to the side to try to get something accomplished that you want is less discrimination. But we've been doing this for a while. I don't know how much it's worked. And so I'd say let all the data in, and then we can see where these disparities exist. Use all of your data and then go back retrospectively and say, what's happening here at an organizational level? Because not everybody is experiencing the same thing. So I think AI can impact DEI considerably, particularly when it comes to hiring and development, employee people experience. I think it could help, but we need to use all the data and it needs to be fed so that we then can analyze that data and let the AI tell us in a very neutral and unbiased way if we programmed it and fed it the right information and trained it properly to say, hey, here's where some gaps are happening. Let's work on things upstream to address those. That's where I think AI has huge opportunity. Otherwise, we need to be mindful that it can seem like it's this black box that people don't see can benefit them and they become scared of it and we don't use it. It's not AI is being created on its own. We're creating this and we have to create it everyone in line and we need to create transparency in these systems and experiment with different things and compare outcomes to human decision making. So human and machine work together mindfully with humans, making sure that the machine gets what it needs to do that and is the most neutral, unbiased way possible. And then AI can serve as a tool to enhance human capability rather than AI being the thing that we turn to in place of human, because AI cannot do what humans do, negatively or positively. But I think positively, there's ways that humans think that AI cannot match. And we need to bet on humans and use AI as a tool, just like we use these cameras and this microphone that I'm recording into right now, but in an elevated manner. So those are 10 questions from past podcasts. I hope and I think maybe perhaps you can take a look at some of those podcasts because we go into a bit of depth. Hope this was helpful. Make it a great day. Peace. If you are committed or simply a little bit curious about how to make DEI accessible to everyone, actionable, that is, unambiguously prioritized and sustainable, aligned with personal and organizational purpose, hit the subscribe button. Make it a great day. Peace.